Hi, welcome back. Let's talk about visualization of data in R using ggplot2. So ggplot2 is an extremely effective visualization package written for R. It's written by Hadley Wickham and is maintained by a number of different very talented people right now. So that's one of the reasons we'll be using it, is that it has lots of ongoing support, and getting help in ggplot2 is a pretty easy thing to do, which is good when you're learning. The other reason that we're using ggplot2 with this course is that it has an underlying logic called the grammar of graphics. It's sort of a unifying framework that is a really helpful system for thinking about graphics with, and that ties in with one of the emphases of this course, which is preparing you for programming fundamentals and setting you up to be able to program well later in R. So the objective here is just to use ggplot2 to make some plots. We're going to follow the approach that the ggplot2 book takes, which is rather than starting with all of the theory and the grammar of graphics, we're just going to dive right in with some of the essentials that you'll need to make your first plots. We'll make some plots, we'll play around with a lot of code, we'll get very familiar with the syntax, and then in the second video we'll take a slightly deeper dive into the actual grammar and logic that is underlying that syntax. And I'm hoping that this approach is going to get you up and running more quickly. And also, I encourage you to check out the ggplot2 workshop that Thomas Lynn Peterson just posted recently. It's a really in-depth workshop taught by one of the maintainers of ggplot2. It's an incredible resource, and it's really neat that they put it online. So I encourage you to go check that out when you get a chance. Okay, so the key components of a ggplot function call, that's the function that's going to actually initialize and start building your plot, are data, aesthetic mappings, and at least one layer. And layers are usually created with the geom set of functions, which stands for geometries. So the first component is your data, and as we've mentioned, for best results, it really needs to be in a tidy format, so observations in rows and variables in columns. The data gets pulled in to the ggplot function call as the first argument. The data is always the first argument. And then attributes of your data will get mapped to various graphical aesthetics, and we'll go into what that means. And then on the lower left here, we just see this, I'm going to keep a running tally of the ggplot code that we're adding with these components. So after data, the next essential component of a ggplot is the aesthetics. And aesthetic is just something that can be made visible. So examples of this would be the axes themselves. The x-axis is visible, the y-axis is visible, points, lines, colors, shapes, line types. Anything that you can think of adding to a graph is probably an aesthetic. And the way that we add them to our graph or a plot is by mapping them to a particular attribute of your data. So when I say mapping, I mean we're tying some attribute of our data to an aesthetic using the mapping argument of the ggplot call. So we map, for example, the depth variable or the depth column of the COD dataset to the x-axis. We're mapping the intensity variable, the intensity column, to the y-axis. So we're mapping that variable, that attribute of your data, to an aesthetic, which is, in this case, an axis, an x-axis or y-axis. We could also map, for example, the year variable to a color aesthetic so that you make sure that each year has a different color. So that's what I mean when I say you're mapping your data to an aesthetic. You're telling an attribute of your data where to go and how to be represented on your graph. And then the third component of a ggplot is a layer. You can have one or more layers. It's just something that you add as you go along to create the plot that you want to make. So for example, if you're making a scatter plot, then the layer would be the points layer. Most of the time when you're adding a layer to your plot, you're going to do it with a geometry call. And then within that geometry call or within that layer, you can map additional variables in your data to aesthetics. So we mentioned mapping year to a color aesthetic. We're doing that here in the geom point layer. So that's telling that layer that the color of that layer is going to be mapped to the year variable. And we'll play around with rearranging the various aesthetic calls into the different components of our ggplot when we move over to R. So hopefully that'll make a bit more sense then. So altogether then, a ggplot is made up of data, mapping of attributes of your data to various aesthetics, and then layers onto your plot. And you can have additional aesthetics within layers. Some of those aesthetics are going to be mapped to variables in your data, but some of those aesthetics can be fixed. So if you know you just want a dashed line type, you don't have to tie that back to anything in your data. You can just tell that line to be dashed or the size to be 0.5. So there are fixed aesthetics, and then there's also mapped aesthetics, and we'll play around with different ones when we go over to R. And let's do that now. All right, here we are in our ggplot2 script. If you haven't already installed the ggplot2 package, you can do that on line 7. You just uncomment it and run that code. Otherwise, let's load it up, and we'll load up our cod parasite data. We'll save it as the object cod, and we'll be working with that to build our plots. And all we're going to do in this script is go through the 3 components that we just talked over in the slides. We'll build them up one by one so that you can see the plot develop as we add the essential components. So the first essential component is the data. We do that by providing our data to the first argument of the ggplot call, and when we run that, it's going to initialize a plot, and that's basically ggplot2 telling you, I know you have this data that you want to visualize, I'm ready to go, but I don't know how you want anything about the data visualized yet. So then the next step, where we actually tell it how we want it visualized, is when we start the aesthetic mapping. So in this next component, where we're mapping things to aesthetics, we have our data, and I'm filling out the full specification here. In the next script, in the next video, I probably won't be as explicit here because a lot of these are going to be default arguments, and the defaults in ggplot2 are pretty good. But here, just so that it's very clear, we are actually filling in the mapping argument with this aesthetic call, and we're mapping the depth variable to the x-axis aesthetic and the intensity variable to the y-axis aesthetic. And just as a reminder, here's what our cod parasite data looks like. So we're taking this depth column and we're putting it on the x-axis, and we're taking this intensity column and putting it on the y-axis. So let's see what that looks like. So it was happy to do that for us. It mapped those variables to those aesthetics, but we still don't see anything because it doesn't know how we want the data to show up on our plot. For that, we have to add a layer. So the next component of our plot is going to be the layer, and we're going to add that layer in the form of point geometry. We're going to make a scatter plot. So we add the exact same code that we had above, and we're just adding this geom point function. And that's going to add our scatter plot layer. So these are our actual observations that we get to see now. It's placing our observations where they belong on the plot based on our aesthetic mappings and the layers that we asked it to add to the plot. If we add more layers, we can add, this isn't going to be a super meaningful plot, by the way. I'm just showing us how ggplot works with these components. So I remember the third component was layers. We can have one or more. Let's add to that point layer, we'll add another layer with a line geometry and another layer with an area geometry. And that's what that looks like. So again, not a meaningful plot, but it hopefully gives you a sense of how you can build up layers in your ggplot. Okay, let's play with some more code, because ggplot is basically all about getting familiar with the syntax and, at least at first, just moving things around and seeing what happens before you really start to get a good understanding of why things are happening. Okay, so this first part of this much longer ggplot specification is just the exact same thing that we did above. And now we're going to build out that point layer a little bit more. So we talked about mapping the year variable to color. I'm going to comment out part of this, or part of the rest of this, so that we can just do a little bit at a time. So let's just run this part here and see what happens to our plot. So now we're not going to have this line and area layer, or we're not going to have those line and area layers. We're just going to have the point layer and the basic mapping that is specified in the original ggplot call. All right, so now we have the 3 different years mapped to 3 different colors. So we put that onto a color aesthetic. And you can add as many data specifications or as many mappings as you think makes sense for you or for your plot. So we're not too concerned again with building meaningful plots here. We're just showing you what happens when you map different variables to different aesthetics. So that was mapping year to color. Let's map the size of the points to the age column. So here's our COD data again. So we have this age column. There are 10 different ages, so mapping these different ages to a size variable should give us a continuous scale of sized points. So let's see what that looks like here. So I'm going to delete this and open that aesthetic call here. We'll finish it out here. And at the same time, I'm going to make the points more transparent. So let's see what all that looks like. Okay, so here's an updated version of our plot. You can see that every time we map a variable to an aesthetic, it will add its own legend. So before we added our own legend for the year, now it's added our own size legend for that aesthetic. Okay, what I want to point out here is that it might be kind of hard to see, but this alpha aesthetic is fixed. It's not actually mapped to any variable in our data. I just set it to a fixed value of 0.2. Alpha controls the transparency. So what this is essentially saying is I want the transparency of all of my points to be equal to a value of 0.2. And because it's a fixed aesthetic, I actually moved it outside of this ACE call. And I put it outside of that call because if you put it inside the call, it thinks you have a variable in your data called 0.02, and so it will generate a legend for you if you do that. So if we just run this part of the code, now it's generated a legend for this data attribute that it thinks our data has called alpha or called 0.2, and it's saying that it's mapped the alpha aesthetic to that, but that's not actually what we wanted. So we're going to move it back outside the aesthetic call. All right, the next thing that we might want to do with this plot is we might want to change the colors. So let's see what it looks like so far. Once we move that alpha call outside the aesthetic, we're back to here. And these colors are nice, but let's say we had some other ones in mind. The way to change the default colors in ggplot2 is to add a scale or to explicitly set the scale for those colors. And we do that with this line of code. We're saying that we want to set the color scale to manual values, and we're going to provide those values in the form of a character vector. These are just the names of some colors that are built into R, so that's why it's able to recognize that. So let's say the next thing that we want to do is remove the color legend. Let's say it's not important to the point that we're trying to make. So we can do that with the guides function, and we're saying we want the guide for color to be none. We don't want one. And for the size guide, so this variable here that's mapped to, or this aesthetic size that's mapped to the age variable, let's say we want its guide to have a title. So the legend title, we want it to be age in years. So this is just some code that's modifying the guides or the legends that are associated with different aesthetics that we have mapped to different parts of our data. So if I run this whole thing, what should happen is we should see this color legend for year disappear, and we should see the title of the size legend, age, switch to age in years. So let's run that. And that's what we get. So I'm going over a lot of this pretty quickly, and that is just in an effort to get you exposed to a lot of ggplot2 code. Like I said, we're going to do a deeper dive into the grammar in the next video. So we'll break some of these things down, and I promise it will start to make more and more sense as you go along. But on your own, let's have you make a scatter plot of the COD data. You can read the instructions as you work through this script on your own. And as you go through on your own and start to rearrange the code and play around with it, You might notice that the three main components that we've been going over, you can put them in different places or different locations in the code. And it seems to be very confusing because you might not know which one you're supposed to do. So what we're going to do is play around with it a little bit and move things to different places and see what happens. So in this first specification, we're going to build this plot a few different times, moving the components around. In this first specification, we're putting the data and the X and Y mapping in this top ggplot call, and then we're adding some layers below. So that just builds the same plot that we saw before. We have a point layer and a line layer, and everything shows up as we expect. If we move the X and Y mapping down to this first point layer, then what that's going to do is specify that you want those points displayed with this mapping to the X and Y axis, but for the geom line layer, it's not going to know what to do. So if we run this, we get an error saying that geom line requires the following missing aesthetics, X and Y. So it doesn't know what you want mapped to this layer because it's not inheriting it the way that it did up here. So the way that it did up here, we put this, this mapping in the ggplot layer, and all the other layers inherited that X and Y mapping. But down here, since we specified that we only wanted it in the point layer, the geom line layer didn't have anything to inherit. So if you want all of your geometries to inherit the same X and Y mappings, then we should put that up in the top ggplot2 call. So the same thing with the data. If we move the data argument around, so if we just initialize the plot with an empty ggplot2 call and we put our data in the point layer and try to build this plot up, it looks the same at first, except you'll notice that nothing is displayed on this geom line layer because nothing was inherited from this top ggplot2 call to go in the geom line layer. So you would have to specify the data again to get that to show up. And also, it's still missing the X and Y, so you would have to specify the X and Y mappings again. So what moving all of this specification up to that top line does is it saves you from having to specify the mappings over and over again in each layer, because the layers will just inherit it from the top call, and then you can just get on with customizing other components of your plot. So that's why we typically put the mappings that you want the whole plot to inherit across all of its layers. You would put that in that top ggplot2 call. And then similarly, so in this last one, I'm just going to show you what happens when you try to map the same or when you try to map two different variables to the same aesthetic. So here we're building a plot where in the point layer, color or prevalence is mapped to color. If we try to specify another mapping up in this top layer, let's say color is mapped to age, and we run that plot, then the age specification takes precedence, and we don't see that color mapping take place later because this geom point layer is inheriting the color mapping from this top call here. So hopefully that makes sense. There's another exercise to do on your own here, and I really just encourage you to play around with this, move things to different places and see what happens, and I hope this was helpful.